Northern France, June 1944, 2 weeks after D-Day. A critical German panzer division, the 2nd SS Das Reich, was racing north from Toulouse toward Normandy, desperately needed to reinforce crumbling German defenses against the Allied breakout. The division consisted of over 15,000 men, 209 tanks and assault guns, and hundreds of support vehicles carrying ammunition, fuel, and supplies. The convoys stretched for kilometers along French roads, trucks, half-tracks, armored cars, fuel tankers, all moving at maximum speed toward the battlefront. Every hour counted. Field Marshal Rommel had personally ordered the division to reach Normandy within 48 hours. Failure could mean the collapse of the entire German defensive line. At 060 hours, the lead vehicle, a Cuba wagon scout car, rounded a curve on the Route Nationale 20 near Limoges. The driver saw nothing unusual. The road ahead looked clear, just another stretch of empty French highway in early morning light. The front left tire exploded. Not a puncture, not a slow leak, a violent explosion that shredded the tire completely, strips of rubber flying in all directions. The Cuba wagon swerved violently, the driver fighting for control, finally bringing it to a stop on the roadside. Behind it, the convoy ground to a halt. You can't pass a disabled vehicle on narrow roads without risking your own tires. German mechanics jumped out to change the tire. Standard procedure: replace the wheel, get moving again. But as they worked, the second vehicle in the convoy, a 3-ton truck carrying ammunition, suffered the same fate. Front tire explosion, complete destruction, vehicle disabled. Then a third vehicle, then a fourth, then vehicles scattered throughout the entire convoy, sometimes 2 or 3 simultaneously. Tires exploding without warning, without visible cause. Within 30 minutes, over 40 vehicles were disabled with destroyed tires. German officers screamed orders, mechanics worked frantically, but they couldn't understand what was happening. There were no mines visible on the road, no bullets fired, no saboteurs attacking, just tires exploding randomly, catastrophically, turning a mobile armored division into a stationary traffic jam. The culprit was invisible. Tiny metal devices scattered across the road surface, each one smaller than a matchbox, painted to blend with the pavement. The British called them tire bursters, and they just delayed the 2nd SS Das Reich division by 3 critical days. 3 days that gave Allied forces time to consolidate their beachhead. 3 days that may have changed the outcome of the Normandy campaign. This is the story of a weapon smaller than your hand that could stop an entire army, and why German soldiers came to fear the roads themselves. Let's go back to 1942. The Special Operations Executive and resistance networks across occupied Europe were conducting sabotage operations against German logistics. They'd blow up bridges, derail trains, destroy fuel depots, classic high-impact targets. But these operations required significant resources, involved high risk, and German engineers could often repair the damage within days. What the SOE needed was something different, a weapon that could disrupt German transportation continuously, required minimal risk to deploy, was nearly impossible to detect or remove, and forced the Germans to waste enormous resources on countermeasures. They needed a weapon that attacked not the vehicles themselves, but something every vehicle needed to function: tires. In 1940s warfare, tires were critical vulnerabilities. Military vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, armored cars, even some light tanks all relied on pneumatic rubber tires. Destroy the tires and the vehicle was immobilized just as effectively as if you destroyed the engine. But tire destruction didn't require explosives powerful enough to damage armored vehicles. You just needed to puncture the rubber. Station 9, working with British industrial designers and metallurgists, developed several anti-vehicular devices. But the most effective was deceptively simple: a small 4-pointed metal device shaped like a child's jack that would always land with one spike pointing upward. Drive over it, and the spike would penetrate the tire, causing immediate catastrophic failure. The concept wasn't new. Similar devices called caltrops had been used in ancient warfare to disable horses and infantry. But Station 9's version was engineered specifically for modern pneumatic tires, with spike lengths, angles, and metal hardness calculated to maximize tire destruction while remaining small enough to scatter by hand or drop from aircraft. And they became one of World War II's most cost-effective sabotage weapons. Creating an effective tire burster required solving engineering challenges that weren't immediately obvious. It couldn't just be any sharp metal object. It needed specific characteristics to maximize effectiveness while remaining practical for field deployment. The basic design was elegant: 4 metal spikes radiating from a central point at tetrahedral angles, meaning that no matter how the device landed, 3 spikes would touch the ground and 1 would always point upward. This geometric principle ensured that even when scattered randomly across roads, every device would present a tire-destroying spike to passing vehicles. Each spike measured approximately 4 to 5 centimeters long, calculated precisely based on tire construction. Too short and the spike might not fully penetrate military-grade tires, which were thicker and more durable than civilian versions. Too long and the devices became unwieldy, difficult to manufacture and deploy. The 4 to 5 centimeter length represented the sweet spot, long enough to punch completely through tire sidewalls, short enough to remain practical. The spike tips were sharpened to needle points and hardened through heat treatment. This hardening process was critical. Soft metal would bend when striking hard rubber, failing to penetrate. But properly hardened steel would punch through even the toughest military tires. Station 9 experimented with various steel alloys, eventually settling on high-carbon steel that could be hardened to optimal penetration capability while remaining cost-effective to mass-produce. 5 degrees between each spike, forming a perfect tetrahedral structure, ensured stability when the device landed. 3 spikes would form a tripod base, preventing the device from rolling or shifting when vehicles approached. The 4th spike stood perpendicular to the road surface, positioned perfectly to intercept tire treads. Weight was another consideration. Each device weighed roughly 20 to 30 grams, heavy enough not to be blown away by wind or vehicle air displacement, light enough that resistance fighters could carry hundreds in a single backpack. An operative could scatter several hundred tire bursters across a road in less than 5 minutes, creating a lethal obstacle zone that would disable dozens of vehicles. Camouflage was built into the design from the start. The devices were painted matte gray, brown, or black to blend with road surfaces. Some versions incorporated a slightly rough texture that mimicked road aggregate, making them nearly invisible even in daylight. When scattered across a road surface, they disappeared into the visual noise of pavement texture, pebbles, and ordinary road debris. Station 9 also developed specialized variants for different operational requirements. Standard versions worked on dry roads. A wet weather variant had slightly longer spikes to compensate for water, creating a cushioning layer between the device and tires. Arctic versions used metal alloys that remained hard in extreme cold. Some steels became brittle in freezing temperatures, and a brittle spike would snap rather than penetrate. There was even a delayed action experimental variant that combined the tire burster with a small time delay explosive charge. These would puncture the tire immediately, but then detonate the charge several seconds later, destroying not just the tire, but potentially damaging the wheel hub and suspension. This variant saw limited production due to complexity and the risk of premature detonation, but it demonstrated Station 9's commitment to maximizing the weapon's effectiveness. Production ramped up rapidly once the design was finalized. Unlike complex weapons requiring precision machining and specialized assembly, tire bursters were simple enough that small workshops could manufacture them. British industrial facilities produced them by the hundreds of thousands. Exact production numbers remain partially classified, but estimates suggest over 2 million tire bursters were manufactured during the war, enough to cover thousands of kilometers of road. Manufacturing was distributed across multiple facilities to reduce vulnerability to bombing and to utilize available production capacity. Some factories produced them as a secondary product alongside other metal components. The simplicity of design meant that even non-specialized workers could assemble them with minimal training, making production highly scalable. Getting tire bursters into the hands of resistance fighters and deploying them effectively required careful planning and coordination. The SOE developed multiple deployment methods optimized for different operational scenarios. Parachute drops were the primary distribution method for occupied territories. Containers of tire bursters, typically several thousand devices per container, were dropped alongside explosives, weapons, and supplies to resistance networks across France, Belgium, Holland, Norway, and other occupied countries. The containers were marked with specific codes indicating contents, allowing resistance members to identify tire burster shipments without opening them in the field. Submarine deliveries supplemented airdrops in coastal regions. British submarines would surface at night off occupied coasts, meeting resistance reception committees who'd row out in small boats to collect supplies. Tire bursters, being non-explosive and relatively compact, were easy to transport this way and didn't require the same security precautions as weapons or radio equipment. Overland smuggling through neutral countries provided another distribution channel. Tire bursters could be concealed as industrial scrap metal or manufacturing waste, hidden among legitimate cargo shipments passing through Spain, Portugal, or Switzerland into occupied territories. German border inspections rarely caught these shipments. Who would suspect that ordinary-looking metal scraps were actually sophisticated sabotage weapons? Once resistance networks received tire bursters, operational deployment followed established protocols developed through trial, error, and lessons learned from early operations. The basic deployment procedure was elegantly simple. Resistance fighters would scout target roads, preferably routes known to carry German military traffic, then scatter tire bursters across the road surface during darkness or periods of low traffic. The entire operation could be completed in minutes with minimal risk of detection. Strategic targeting made the difference between nuisance and strategic impact. Resistance networks coordinated with Allied intelligence to identify high-value targets. Roads leading to ports where U-boats were based, supply routes to the Atlantic Wall fortifications, convoy routes feeding German units at the front lines, and roads connecting major military installations. Deploying tire bursters on these critical routes created maximum disruption with minimal resources. The French Maquis became particularly expert at tire burster operations. In the months before D-Day, French resistance cells conducted hundreds of road sabotage operations across southern and central France. They'd deploy tire bursters on roads the Germans would use to move reinforcements northward, creating delays measured in days rather than hours. One Maquis cell in the Dordogne region reportedly disabled over 200 German vehicles in a 2-week period, using fewer than 3,000 tire bursters, an extraordinary return on investment. Timing was often coordinated with other operations. Resistance networks would deploy tire bursters immediately after Allied bombing raids on bridges or rail lines, ensuring that when Germans tried to reroute via roads, those roads would be treacherous. Or they'd deploy them just before planned ambushes, ensuring that German response forces trying to reach attacked convoys would themselves be delayed by tire failures. The psychological impact on German forces was immediate and severe. Soldiers driving through occupied territories knew resistance fighters could be hiding anywhere, but tire bursters created a different kind of fear, the fear that the road itself was the enemy. Every kilometer driven was a risk. Every stretch of highway could hide hundreds of tiny metal spikes waiting to destroy your tires. This created constant low-level anxiety that degraded morale and operational effectiveness. German forces responded with increasingly desperate countermeasures. They deployed road-sweeping teams ahead of important convoys, soldiers literally walking the road surface with brooms, trying to sweep away tire bursters before vehicles passed. This was time-consuming, exhausting work that slowed convoy speeds to a crawl and tied up infantry who could have been fighting. Some German units tried using mine detectors, reasoning that the metal devices might trigger detection equipment. This worked occasionally. Detectors would ping on concentrations of tire bursters. But false alarms from natural metal debris, spent shell casings, and other road detritus made this method impractical for routine use. Sweeping every kilometer of road with mine detectors before convoys passed would reduce convoy speeds to perhaps 5 kilometers per hour, making the countermeasure worse than the threat. Desperate German commanders ordered subordinates to drive on vehicle treads rather than tires when passing through suspected danger zones. This destroyed the treads but theoretically protected against tire bursters. However, this tactic was only possible for tracked vehicles like tanks and half-tracks. The majority of German logistics depended on wheeled trucks that had no alternative to tires. Even for tracked vehicles, running on bare treads damaged the tracks and suspension systems, creating maintenance problems that accumulated over time. In some areas, Germans attempted to pave over sections of road with concrete or asphalt, reasoning that fresh paving would cover any tire bursters already deployed and make future deployment more obvious. This worked temporarily but required massive resources, construction materials, engineering units, time. Resistance networks would simply wait for the paving operation to finish, then deploy fresh tire bursters on the newly paved surface. The cat and mouse game continued endlessly. German security forces tried to catch resistance members in the act of deploying tire bursters by setting up concealed observation posts overlooking suspected deployment zones. They'd watch roads for hours or days, hoping to catch saboteurs in the act. This yielded occasional arrests, but couldn't cover all roads, and experienced resistance fighters learned to vary their operational patterns, choosing different roads and times to avoid predictable behavior. Perhaps the most telling indication of tire burster effectiveness was the German decision to reroute high-priority convoys through longer, more circuitous routes that avoided known or suspected deployment zones. This added days to transit times but reduced the risk of tire destruction. When your enemy forces you to avoid entire roads, making you take longer routes that consume more fuel and time, they've achieved strategic victory without firing a shot. The Das Reich Division's delayed arrival in Normandy, mentioned in our opening, is the most famous example of tire burster impact, but it was far from unique. Dozens of German units across occupied Europe experienced significant delays due to tire destruction. Some delays were measured in hours, others in days. Accumulated across thousands of vehicles and hundreds of convoys throughout the war, the total delay imposed on German logistics by these tiny metal devices was enormous. Allied intelligence attempted to quantify the impact through signals intelligence and resistance reports. Conservative estimates suggest tire bursters disabled over 50,000 German military vehicles during the war, forcing repairs, replacement, and operational delays. Some of these vehicles were disabled permanently when replacement tires weren't available. Others were repaired but suffered repeated failures on subsequent journeys. The cumulative effect was a continuous degradation of German mobility at a time when mobility meant everything. As tire burster deployment intensified, German forces developed increasingly sophisticated countermeasures, creating an escalating technological and tactical competition. The Germans recognized they were fighting a war they couldn't fully win. You can't remove every tiny metal device from thousands of kilometers of road, but they could reduce the impact through various methods. The most direct countermeasure was massive deployment of road sweeping teams. German units began traveling with dedicated pioneer detachments whose sole job was clearing roads before convoys passed. These teams used everything from industrial brooms to improvised magnetic sweepers dragged behind vehicles, trying to collect tire bursters before they could cause damage. The effectiveness was limited. Tire bursters scattered across a road were difficult to see and easy to miss, especially at night or in poor weather. German engineers developed specialized vehicles equipped with heavy rollers or thick steel mesh screens that rolled ahead of the convoy, theoretically triggering tire bursters or pushing them aside before vulnerable vehicles reached them. These contraptions were heavy, slow, and only marginally effective. A determined resistance cell could deploy enough tire bursters that even with sweeper vehicles, some would get through and disable trucks following behind. The Luftwaffe contributed by conducting low-altitude reconnaissance flights over critical roads before important convoys moved, photographing road surfaces and looking for evidence of recent tire burster deployment, disturbances in road surface, unusual scattering patterns, anything suspicious. This was expensive, consumed flight hours better used for combat operations, and often missed deployments that occurred after the reconnaissance but before the convoy. German requisition of civilian vehicles created an unexpected problem. As military trucks were disabled by tire bursters and replacement tires grew scarce, German forces increasingly commandeered civilian vehicles from occupied populations. But civilian vehicles had even less durable tires than military trucks, making them more vulnerable to tire bursters. This created a vicious cycle. More vehicles needed, more vehicles vulnerable, more vehicles disabled, even more vehicles needed. Tire technology became a surprising strategic concern. German tire manufacturers attempted to develop puncture-resistant designs, thicker rubber, reinforced sidewalls, self-sealing compounds that would close small punctures. Some of these innovations worked marginally, but they couldn't fully defeat a hardened steel spike driven through rubber by the vehicle's own weight. Physics favored the spike over the tire. The German High Command considered but ultimately rejected a plan to develop vehicles with solid rubber tires, eliminating the pneumatic tire vulnerability entirely. The plan failed because solid tires dramatically reduced vehicle speed and fuel efficiency, increased wear on mechanical components, and reduced load capacity. The cure would have been worse than the disease, effectively crippling German logistics to protect against a sabotage threat. Security protocols around German motor pools intensified dramatically. Guards were posted at vehicle parking areas specifically to watch for sabotage attempts, including the possibility that resistance members might place tire bursters under parked vehicles' tires, ensuring destruction as soon as the vehicle moved. This consumed security manpower that could have been used elsewhere and created logistical bottlenecks, as vehicles couldn't be moved without security clearance and inspection. Reprisal policies were implemented to terrorize populations into avoiding tire burster deployment. German security forces would execute civilians in villages near roads where tire bursters were found, reasoning that collective punishment would discourage sabotage. This policy backfired spectacularly. Rather than intimidating resistance networks, it drove more people into active resistance, increasing rather than decreasing sabotage operations. Intelligence efforts focused on identifying tire burster supply chains. The Gestapo and SD attempted to trace the devices back to their source. Where were they manufactured? How were they distributed? Who received them? Several resistance networks were compromised through these investigations, but the distributed nature of tire burster production and the large number of devices already deployed meant that capturing one cell or supply route barely impacted overall availability. German forces even attempted their own tire burster deployments, scattering the devices on roads in areas where partisan forces operated, hoping to disable resistance vehicles. This was rarely effective. Resistance fighters familiar with the devices knew how to spot and avoid them, while German forces occasionally disabled their own vehicles when they forgot which roads they'd seeded with tire bursters. The escalating countermeasure war created bizarre scenarios where both sides deployed similar weapons against each other while simultaneously trying to protect themselves from those weapons. Roads became contested territory in a way no one had anticipated at the war's start, not through traditional military control, but through microscopic sabotage weapons that turned every journey into a calculated risk. By 1944, the Germans had essentially conceded that they couldn't eliminate the tire burster threat. Their strategy shifted from elimination to mitigation, accepting that a certain percentage of vehicles would be disabled, planning for delays, carrying extra spare tires, traveling in smaller convoys that were less attractive targets. This represented a strategic victory for the Allies, forcing the enemy to adapt their entire logistics system to counter a weapon that cost pennies to produce. Despite their effectiveness, tire bursters had significant limitations and created unintended consequences that complicated their use. No weapon is perfect, and the tire burster's simplicity, while a strength, also created vulnerabilities and ethical concerns. The most obvious limitation was their indiscriminate nature. Tire bursters couldn't distinguish between German military vehicles and civilian vehicles used by occupied populations. French farmers, Belgian truck drivers, Dutch merchants all risked tire destruction when driving on roads where resistance fighters had deployed the devices. This created tension between resistance networks and the civilian populations they claimed to protect. Some resistance cells attempted to mitigate this by deploying tire bursters only on roads exclusively used by German military traffic, or by posting warnings to local populations to avoid certain roads during specific periods. But these precautions were imperfect. Civilians who hadn't received warnings, who couldn't read posted notices, or who had no alternative routes would occasionally destroy their tires on resistance-deployed devices. The economic impact on already impoverished populations was significant. Replacement tires were expensive and scarce during wartime. Weather conditions dramatically affected effectiveness. Heavy rain could wash tire bursters off road surfaces into ditches and drainage areas, reducing deployment density and effectiveness. Wind could scatter them unpredictably, creating gaps in coverage. Snow and ice buried them completely, rendering them useless until spring thaws revealed them, often in unexpected locations where they'd been carried by meltwater. Vehicle speed influenced outcomes in counterintuitive ways. Slower vehicles had more time to spot tire bursters on the road surface, potentially allowing drivers to swerve around them. But slower speeds also meant the tire spent more time in contact with the spike during penetration, increasing the likelihood of full puncture. Faster vehicles might strike tire bursters without drivers seeing them, but high-speed impacts sometimes drove the spike through the tire so self-sealing compounds could partially close the puncture. Optimal effectiveness occurred at moderate speeds, fast enough that drivers couldn't avoid them, slow enough that penetration was complete. German use of tracked vehicles, particularly tanks and half-tracks, rendered tire bursters useless against a significant portion of German mobile forces. While wheeled logistics vehicles remained vulnerable, the armored spearheads that tracked vehicles represented could pass over tire burster fields without damage. Resistance networks couldn't stop a panzer advance with tire bursters alone. They needed different weapons for different targets. Manufacturing quality variations created reliability issues. Devices produced by different facilities or from different material batches sometimes had inconsistent hardness, leading to spikes that bent rather than penetrated, or points that dulled quickly after a few vehicles passed over them without striking tires. Quality control was challenging when production was distributed across numerous small workshops with varying expertise and equipment. Recovery and reuse by German forces occasionally turned the weapon against its creators. German pioneer units that successfully swept roads would collect hundreds of tire bursters, which could theoretically be redeployed on roads used by Allied forces. This rarely happened in practice. The Germans lacked the covert networks necessary for effective deployment, but the theoretical possibility existed. The civilian cost extended beyond economics to include casualties. Tire failures could cause vehicle accidents, particularly when the failure occurred at high speed or on dangerous road sections. Several documented cases exist of civilian vehicles crashing after tire failures caused by resistance-deployed bursters, resulting in injuries and even deaths. Resistance organizations grappled with the moral complexity of these collateral casualties. Were they acceptable costs of liberation, or did they represent a betrayal of the people they fought to free? Post-war clearance became a massive problem. Millions of tire bursters had been scattered across European roads during the war. Most were never recovered. They remained dangerous for years after hostilities ended, destroying tires on civilian vehicles, farm equipment, even bicycles. Road maintenance crews gradually collected them over time, but the process took years. Some remote rural roads in France still occasionally yield tire bursters discovered during roadwork, 80 years after deployment. Friendly fire incidents affected Allied forces as they advanced across previously occupied territories. American, British, and Canadian vehicles occasionally encountered tire bursters that resistance networks had deployed weeks or months earlier. The resistance couldn't always communicate deployment locations to advancing Allied forces. And even when they tried, battlefield confusion meant the information didn't always reach the right units at the right time. The psychological toll on resistance members who deployed tire bursters was often overlooked. Unlike more direct combat or sabotage operations, tire burster deployment had an abstract quality. You scattered metal devices on roads and left, never knowing whether they succeeded, whether they disabled military or civilian vehicles, whether they caused intended disruption or unintended harm. This uncertainty created moral ambiguity that some resistance fighters struggled with long after the war ended. After 1945, the tire burster concept influenced military and law enforcement practices worldwide, evolving through technological advancement while retaining the core principle: immobilizing vehicles by destroying tires. The basic design's elegance ensured its persistence across decades of military innovation. Post-war mine clearance operations across Europe discovered the enormous scale of tire burster deployment. In France alone, road maintenance crews collected an estimated several 100,000 tire bursters during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Many were corroded or damaged, but still capable of puncturing tires. The French government implemented systematic road sweeping programs in rural areas, gradually reducing but never fully eliminating the residual tire burster population. The Korean War saw renewed interest in tire burster technology. United Nations forces used similar devices, sometimes actual World War II surplus from British stocks, to disrupt North Korean and Chinese logistics along supply routes. Communist forces developed their own variants, scattering them on roads used by UN supply convoys. The mountainous Korean terrain made road networks especially vulnerable to this type of sabotage, as alternative routes were often limited or non-existent. Vietnam War applications included sophisticated variants developed by both sides. American forces deployed modernized tire bursters, called road denial munitions in military terminology, on routes used by North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong supply columns along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These were often deployed via aircraft, scattered from low-flying planes or helicopters in patterns designed to maximize road coverage. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong used similar devices against South Vietnamese and American convoys, sometimes manufacturing crude versions from locally available materials. Cold War developments included specialized designs for specific scenarios. NATO forces developed tire bursters designed to delay Soviet armored advances through urban areas, where tracked vehicles would be supplemented by wheeled logistics vehicles vulnerable to the devices. Warsaw Pact forces developed similar weapons, along with countermeasures including armored vehicle designs with run-flat tires or auxiliary wheel systems that allowed continued movement after tire destruction. Modern police and security forces use direct descendants of the World War II tire burster concept. Traffic spike strips, deployable devices that puncture vehicle tires during pursuits, operate on identical principles. Hardened spikes position to intercept tires, causing rapid deflation and vehicle immobilization. These modern variants are typically retractable and connected in strips for controlled deployment, but the fundamental mechanism remains unchanged. Military applications continue in asymmetric warfare contexts. Insurgent and resistance movements worldwide have employed tire burster-type devices against occupation forces, peacekeeping missions, and government forces. The simplicity of construction means that technically unsophisticated groups can manufacture effective versions using basic metalworking tools and scrap materials. Instructions for building tire bursters appear in numerous insurgent training manuals and online resources, demonstrating the design's enduring relevance. Counterterrorism forces developed countermeasures including puncture-resistant tires with reinforced sidewalls, run-flat technologies that allow vehicles to continue operating after tire damage, and vehicle designs that minimize ground clearance to prevent spikes from penetrating upward into tires. These innovations represent the ongoing technological competition between mobility and anti-mobility weapons that tire bursters initiated. Law enforcement agencies studying crowd control and riot situations examine tire bursters as potential tools for creating vehicle barriers during civil disturbances. Deploying devices across roads could theoretically prevent unauthorized vehicle access to protected areas. However, the indiscriminate nature and difficulty of rapid removal limited adoption. Most agencies chose mechanical barriers that could be quickly positioned and removed. Commercial applications emerged in unexpected contexts. Some private security firms use tire burster-inspired devices to protect facilities from vehicle-borne attacks, deploying them in access roads or perimeter areas. These are typically more sophisticated than military versions, incorporating remote activation systems that allow security personnel to deploy or retract them as needed, avoiding the uncontrolled nature of scattered devices. Environmental and humanitarian concerns arose regarding persistent deployment of anti-vehicle devices in conflict zones. International organizations, including the United Nations, expressed concerns that tire bursters left in place after conflicts end create long-term hazards for civilian populations, similar to landmines, though generally less lethal. Efforts to include tire bursters under anti-personnel mine treaties have been unsuccessful. The devices don't meet technical definitions of mines and aren't primarily anti-personnel weapons. Academic studies of World War II logistics warfare consistently cite tire bursters as exemplifying cost-effective sabotage, minimal resource investment creating disproportionate enemy disruption. Military strategists studying asymmetric warfare use tire bursters as case studies in how technologically inferior forces can effectively challenge stronger opponents through innovative application of simple technologies. Museum collections preserve examples of World War II tire bursters, though they're often overlooked in favor of more dramatic weapons. The Imperial War Museum holds several variants in their collections, usually displayed alongside other sabotage equipment. Some French regional museums focused on resistance history display tire bursters prominently, recognizing their significance in local liberation efforts. Veterans of resistance movements who deploy tire bursters rarely received recognition comparable to those who conducted more dramatic operations. Blowing up a bridge earned medals and commemoration. Scattering metal spikes on roads was less celebrated despite potentially comparable strategic impact. Post-war interviews with resistance veterans reveal some frustration at this disparity. Those who risked their lives deploying tire bursters felt their contributions were undervalued compared to more violent forms of resistance. Behind the statistics and strategic analysis were human beings whose lives intersected with these small metal devices in profound ways. The tire burster story is ultimately about people, those who deployed them, those targeted by them, and those caught between. Resistance fighters who deploy tire bursters describe the experience as simultaneously empowering and morally complex. One French Maquis member, interviewed in the 1980s, recalled, "We knew every handful of these things we scattered meant German trucks disabled, German convoys delayed, maybe German soldiers who wouldn't reach the front in time to kill our Allied liberators. But we also knew French drivers would hit them too. My own cousin destroyed both front tires on his truck delivering food to market." German soldiers who experienced tire failures developed complex attitudes toward both the weapons and the populations among whom they served. Some became paranoid, seeing every French civilian as a potential saboteur. Others developed grudging respect for the cleverness of the weapon. One German veteran wrote in his memoir that the tire burster was brilliant in its simplicity. "We had Tiger tanks, V-2 rockets, jet aircraft, technological marvels, and we were defeated by metal spikes that any blacksmith could make." Civilian populations in occupied territories had complicated relationships with resistance tire burster operations. Many supported them intellectually. Anything that hurt the Germans was good, but dealing with the practical consequences was difficult. Farmers who relied on trucks for agricultural work faced economic disaster when tires were destroyed and replacements were unavailable or unaffordable. Some rural communities developed informal warning systems, alerting each other when roads were seeded, allowing locals to avoid those routes while German convoys still encountered them. Children who grew up in occupied territories during the war years sometimes collected tire bursters as toys or curiosities, unaware of their lethal purpose to vehicles if not to people directly. Several documented cases exist of children injured when they played with collected tire bursters. Puncture wounds from the sharp spikes causing infections that in some cases became serious medical emergencies given wartime shortages of antibiotics and medical care. German soldiers assigned to road sweeping duties described the work as simultaneously boring and terrifying. Hours spent walking roads, bending to examine every piece of debris, never knowing if the next handful of metal you swept up contained tire bursters or if you'd missed devices that would disable vehicles in your own convoy. One soldier's diary entry from 1944 described it as Sisyphean labor. We clear a road today, they reseed it tomorrow. The psychological warfare aspect affected even soldiers who never personally encountered tire bursters. The knowledge that roads were potentially hostile, that every journey carried risk, created constant low-level anxiety. Modern psychological research on military stress recognizes that constant threat, even if rarely realized, degrades mental health and combat effectiveness as much as acute danger. Tire bursters contributed to this chronic stress among German forces occupying hostile territories. Post-war reconciliation in communities torn by occupation included dealing with resentment over tire burster deployments.
En certains villages, civiliens qui suffered economic losses from tire destruction arboraient ressentiment à l'égard de formeurs résistentiels, compliquant effort à hisser wartime division. Ces tensions étaient rarement discutées publiquement, la résistance était valorisée en post-libération France et critiquant leurs méthodes était socialement acceptable, mais privé-familial dispute s'en faisait souvent l'objet. Germain militaire record, capturés après la guerre, révélaient la stratégie impact de leur perspective. Logistics Officers Reports consistamment citaient road sabotage, incluant tire destruction, comme majeur facteur dégradant supply efficiency. Un rapport de l'armée groupe B en France, daté juillet 1944, estimait que les Tire Burster Operations avaient réduit les convois speed par 40% et incrémenté fuel consumption par 25%, dû aux détours, délais et le besoin d'opérer sweeper véhicules avant les convois. Ces figures représentaient stratégique dégradation achevée par des armes qui coûtaient hollement 9 heures à produire. Ethic débat Vita resistance movements about tire burster deployment were documented in memoirs and historical interviews. Certains résistance leaders arguaient que la nature indiscriminée de la marque, son potentiel à armer civiliens, m'était moralement questionnable despite son militaire efficacité. Autres contraires, que toute guerre implique des cas civiliens et que minimiser ces cas tout en faisant efficacement la guerre était impossible. Ces débats reflétaient brodards questions à propos de l'éthique de la résistance warfare qui continue de résonner dans modernes conflits. Les familles de Germains soldats tués indirectement par Tire Burster Operations, soldats qui mouraient parce que renforcement était retardé par tire failures et ne pouvaient pas rejoindre besiégées unités, carrière griffe compliquée par l'inusuelle nature de la marque. Il n'y avait pas ennemi à haïr, non soldat qui avait tiré la shot, juste un métal dislancé sur une rode. Cette abstraite qualité de l'attrait rendait processus de griffe difficile pour certaines familles. Allied soldats avançant à l'Europe occasionnellement découvraient des sites de Tire Burster Deployment, où évidence d'opérations de résistance restait visible, discarded containers from supply drops, hâtivement abandonné deployment equipment, 100 fois même résistentiel encore opérant dans la zone. Ces rencontres créent moments de connexion entre professionnels alliés soldats et civils resistance fighters, mutuelle reconnaissance de shared purpose, despite vastement différentes méthodes et risques.
The tire burster never appeared in victory parades. It never inspired stirring propaganda posters. No war memorials commemorate the thousands of German vehicles it disabled or the countless hours of German time it consumed. In the grand narrative of World War II, dominated by tank battles, aerial combat, and infantry assaults, a tiny metal spike seems almost comically insignificant. But that insignificance was an illusion. The tire burster represented something profound about warfare, that strategic impact doesn't require complexity, expense, or sophistication. Sometimes, the most effective weapons are the simplest ones, weapons so basic that their very simplicity becomes their strength. Station 9's engineers created a device that cost pennies to manufacture, required no training to deploy, demanded no maintenance, needed no operators, and remained lethal for months or years after deployment. Compare this to a tank costing hundreds of thousands of pounds, requiring trained crew, constant maintenance, enormous logistical support, and vulnerable to mechanical failure. Which weapon offered better return on investment? The answer isn't obvious, but it's not automatically the tank. The tire burster turned roads, infrastructure the Germans needed to control occupied territories, into hostile territory. Every kilometer driven became a calculated risk. Every convoy journey required sweeping, delays, security, resources diverted from combat operations. The cumulative effect was a continuous degradation of German mobility at precisely the moment when mobility meant everything. For resistance movements, the tire burster provided a weapon they could actually use. Unlike explosives that require training or firearms that risk capture and execution, tire bursters were simple enough for anyone to deploy. A teenager, an elderly farmer, a shopkeeper. Anyone could scatter these devices across a road in darkness and walk away, having struck a blow against occupation that would ripple through German logistics for days or weeks. The German response, the sweeping teams, the security protocols, the detours, the paranoia, represented victory even when specific tire bursters failed to disable vehicles. Making your enemy afraid of roads, forcing them to waste resources protecting against a threat that cost almost nothing to create, disrupting their operations through fear as much as through actual damage, this is warfare at its most efficient. Modern military forces studying asymmetric warfare inevitably examined the tire burster as a case study in effective low-technology resistance. The principles it demonstrated remain valid. Exploit enemy vulnerabilities, use simple technologies effectively, create disproportionate impact relative to resources invested, force the enemy to respond in ways that drain their strength even when your weapons don't directly destroy their forces. The tire burster's legacy lives on in every spike strip police use, every road denial munition military forces deploy, every anti-vehicle device insurgents manufacture. The form evolves, materials improve, triggers become more sophisticated, deployment methods change, but the fundamental concept endures because it works. Puncture the tire, stop the vehicle, deny the enemy mobility. So why did this brilliant British tire burster halt entire German convoys? Because British engineers understood that you don't need to destroy a vehicle to stop it, you just need to destroy its tires. Because resistance fighters had the courage to scatter these devices on roads patrolled by enemies who would execute them if caught. Because sometimes the smallest weapons create the largest impacts. The Germans had Tiger tanks, V-2 rockets, jet fighters, technological marvels that represented the cutting edge of 1940s military engineering. The Allies countered with, among other things, small metal spikes scattered on roads, and those spikes, implausible as it seems, contributed meaningfully to Allied victory. That's the paradox and power of the tire burster. It was simple enough for a child to understand, but effective enough to frustrate entire armies. It cost almost nothing, but achieved results measured in days of delay, thousands of disabled vehicles, countless tons of supplies that never reached their destinations. The 2nd SS Das Reich Division, delayed by tire bursters on its way to Normandy, finally arrived days late, too late to meaningfully impact the Allied breakout from the beaches. Those 3 days, purchased by tiny metal spikes scattered on French roads, may have changed the war's trajectory. We'll never know for certain what would have happened if that division had arrived on time, but we know it didn't. And among the reasons why, scattered across kilometers of French roads, were thousands of small metal devices, each one a tiny triumph of simplicity over complexity, of cleverness over brute force. That's why the tire burster matters. Not because it was dramatic or powerful or sophisticated, but precisely because it was none of those things and worked anyway. From tire bursters that stopped panzers, to floating mines that hunted U-boats, to tree stumps that spied on enemy camps, World War II weapons reveals how simple innovation defeated sophisticated armies. Subscribe now for more untold stories of the ingenious weapons that changed history. Sometimes the smallest weapons make the biggest difference.